Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking a really close look at a massive piece of research. It's a systematic review and meta-analysis focusing entirely on the critical risk factors for abdominal aortic aneurysm, or AAA. Now, if you've heard of AAA, you probably know it's often called the silent killer. And understanding the risk factors is, well, it's pretty much the only effective preventative measure we currently have.
It really is. This is a condition where the stakes couldn't be higher. Exactly, because it is so often asymptomatic, in its early stages.
Right.
Clinically, we define a AAA as a permanent local dilation of the abdominal aorta. That's the body's main pipeline, basically. Typically where the diameter gets bigger than about 3 centimeters or maybe more than 50% wider than its normal size.
And the risk associated with that bulge, that dilation, it's genuinely terrifying.
Exactly. When that aneurysm ruptures, the mortality rate can shoot up to, well, a staggering 80%.
80%. Wow.
Yeah. That single terrifying statistic really underscores why identifying and crucially acting upon the risk factors, which is the whole point of this dump dive, is just absolutely essential for public health.
And to get a sense of the scale here, the sources give us a pretty clear prevalence snapshot, and it highlights this huge difference based on biological sex, right?
That's right. The research notes that AAA affects somewhere between 3.9% and maybe 7.2% of males, but only about 1.0% to 1.3% of females.
So right off the bat, we know this isn't hitting everyone equally. There's a definite gender bias.
There is, yeah. And our understanding here is based on exceptionally robust data. The systematic review we're digging into synthesized data from 34 separate studies.
34, okay.
And reporting on an incredible 34,551 AAA cases. That kind of massive scale lets us draw some really stable, reliable conclusions about which associations are genuinely driving the risk for AAA.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's give our listener the blueprint right away. What are the definitive factors that this huge analysis linked to an increased risk of AAA? Kind of the big picture overview.
Okay, so we've got a fairly long list, but it's necessary. The factors definitely associated with increased risk include male sex, smoking, either current or ever smoking, hypertension, dyslipidaemia, which is, cholesterol issues, and then a whole cluster of pre-existing conditions. Coronary artery disease, CAD, cerebrovascular disease, peripheral vascular disease, PVD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, renal disease, and this is a big one, a family history of AAA.
That list, it sounds like a really powerful signal that AAA isn't just some isolated thing happening in the aorta. It seems like it's often a symptom of wider systemic vascular problems.
That's a very good way to look at it.
But what makes this deep dive really fascinating, I think, is the finding that kind of flips conventional vascular wisdom on its head a bit.
Ah, yes, the paradox. The analysis found that diabetes mellitus, or DM, was actually associated with a reduced risk of AAA.
Reduced with diabetes.
Reduced. Yeah, it's a really counterintuitive finding. It suggests there's some kind of complex, nuanced biomechanical protective thing going on, which runs completely contrary to how diabetes affects pretty much every other artery in the body.
Okay, that's something we definitely need to explore. And one more crucial layer of nuance before we dive into the numbers specifically. The researchers found that the association between AAA risk and 6 key factors, sex, smoking, hypertension, DM, renal disease, and family history, it actually differs significantly depending on whether the population studied was Eastern or Western.
That geographical split is really important. It means that regional lifestyle factors, maybe genetic factors, can drastically alter an individual's risk profile.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that global health often needs that local policy translation.
Exactly right.
Okay, let's start where the data starts, with the factors showing the highest risk magnitude, the real heavy hitters. These are the 2 dominant factors with an odds ratio, or OR, greater than 3.0. Let's begin with male sex.
Right, so being male carried the single highest risk of all the factors they analyzed. The odds ratio was 3.78.
3.78.
Yeah. So when we talk about an odds ratio like that, we're basically saying that a male subject is nearly 4 times more likely to develop AAA compared to a female subject.
Yeah.
Assuming, all other measured factors are equal. The size of that effect is just staggering.
4 times the risk. Why? Why such a profound difference? That suggests something more fundamental biologically, not just, say, different lifestyle choices between sexes, right? What are the key theories the research points to?
Well, the primary thinking is that it involves hormonal profiles. Estrogen, which is obviously dominant in premenopausal females, is known to have a kind of protective effect on the vascular wall integrity.
Okay.
And it might also modulate the inflammatory responses that tend to drive that aneurysmal degradation. Males just lack that same protective hormonal environment. And on top of that, the sources did note higher historical rates of smoking and perhaps specific lifestyle factors that correlate more closely with the male demographic, which could compound that underlying biological risk.
Okay, so a biological baseline difference potentially amplified by lifestyle. That disparity leads us straight into the second dominant factor, which is probably the most impactful modifiable risk factor on this entire list. Smoking.
Absolutely. Current or ever smoking also showed a really substantial risk with an odds ratio of 3.39.
3.39. So almost as high as being male.
Exactly. It puts smoking right up there, on par with the inherent risk of being male. So if you are a male smoker, you're essentially stacking the two biggest risks right on top of each other.
Let's just pause on that OR of 3.39 for a second. We're going to see later that having existing coronary artery disease, a major heart issue, that has an OR of 1.81. This means the risk you carry just by smoking is nearly double the risk associated with already having established heart disease. That feels like a really crucial takeaway for listeners.
It is. It really highlights the danger, and the research provides a pretty terrifying biological breakdown of why smoking is so destructive, specifically to the abdominal aorta. Nicotine seems to be the main chemical culprit.
So what's happening at the cellular level? What is nicotine actually doing that makes the aortic wall almost disintegrate?
Well, nicotine seems to act like a signal flare. It specifically activates something called tissue plasminogen activators, or TPA. Now, TPA has a normal role in the body, but overactivating it triggers this dangerous cascade.
Okay.
This cascade then induces immune cells, called macrophages, to produce an excess of these really destructive enzymes known as matrix metalloproteinases, or MMPs.
MMPs. I think of them as like the body's molecular demolition crew, necessary for repair sometimes, but here they're just going rogue.
That's a great analogy. Nicotine basically throws this demolition crew into overdrive. It overwhelms the vessel's ability to maintain its structure, and this cascade severely disrupts the synthesis of collagen.
Collagen being the main sort of structural scaffold.
Exactly. The main stabilizing component of the artery. So ultimately, nicotine is shown to weaken the vascular wall, drastically increase this collagolytic activity, that's the collagen breakdown, and promote the rapid degradation of both elastin and collagen in the abdominal aorta.
It's like an internal chemical attack, just dismantling the vessel's foundation.
Wow.
The conclusion for public health seems unavoidable then. If we're looking for the highest impact early intervention, smoking cessation has got to be the most direct, the most necessary strategy.
It's absolutely non-negotiable. Targeting smoking cessation, particularly in older males who are already at higher baseline risk, is the critical first step in prevention, no question.
Okay. So moving on from those two dominant factors, let's look at the next tier of risk. We've kind of called this the cardiovascular cluster and systemic inflammation group. These are factors with odds ratios mostly ranging from about 1.3 up to maybe 2.2, and they really confirm that generalized systemic disease signals major AAA risk. Let's start with the genetic piece, family history.
Right. Family history of AAA came in pretty strong with an OR of 2.26. That's highly significant.
So more than double the risk.
Yeah. If you have a first-degree relative, so a parent or a sibling who had an AAA, your own risk is more than doubled. And this isn't just about, maybe shared environmental factors like living in the same house. The mechanism is thought to be a mix of actual genetic susceptibility, perhaps specific inflammatory markers that are inherited, and possibly an underlying impaired endothelial function that makes the aorta just a bit more fragile to begin with.
Okay. And then we see the sort of usual suspects, the conditions that really confirm the systemic nature of this disease. We've got coronary artery disease, CAD, affecting the heart, at an OR of 1.81, peripheral vascular disease, PVD, affecting the limbs at 1.67, and cerebrovascular disease affecting the brain at 1.32.
Exactly. If you think of the aorta as the central highway of the vascular system, these three conditions are like major accidents happening on the main exit ramps.
Okay, yeah.
So if you have established atherosclerotic disease already causing problems in your heart vessels or your leg vessels or your brain vessels, the evidence strongly suggests that the central highway itself, the aorta, is also undergoing that same damaging inflammatory and degradation process. AAA is very rarely a surprise out of the blue. It's usually a downstream sign of widespread arterial trouble.
That makes sense. Now, what's fascinating and maybe a bit less intuitive is the inclusion of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. That showed a strong link, too, with an OR of 1.58. It feels like a lung issue primarily, but the source is clear this connection is deeply vascular and inflammatory.
It is. The link really is inflammation and those shared risk factors again. COPD, AAA, CAD, hypertension, they often travel together because they share those foundational triggers, primarily smoking, but also just generalized systemic inflammation.
So the inflammation from the lungs doesn't just stay in the lungs.
No, exactly. Chronic lung inflammation generates these inflammatory signals, cytokines, that circulate throughout the entire body. And they could accelerate that vascular wall weakening process in vulnerable spots, like the aorta.
So the body's inflammatory machinery, whether it's initially triggered by smoke in the lungs or maybe plaque in the arteries, that's what ends up damaging the aortic wall structure.
Precisely. It's really an overarching theme of systemic breakdown.
Okay, let's look now at the metabolic and pressure factors. These are often the things we can try to manage medically. We really need to talk about renal disease next, because it showed a surprisingly high risk factor, almost doubling the odds at an OR of 1.91.
Yes, the risk tied to renal disease is profound. And the suggested mechanism is, well, it's a bit complex. Chronic kidney disease causes a state called uremia, basically a buildup of waste products in the blood.
Right.
And that state results in widespread chronic systemic inflammation. That inflammation alone is a powerful driver of AAA risk.
But the sources mention something else too, something about new blood vessel formation.
Yes, exactly. The research suggests that patients with advanced renal disease, especially maybe those dealing with infections or on long-term dialysis, they might be more prone to developing what's called abnormal neovascularization.
Neovascularization.
New and often dysfunctional blood vessels forming within the wall of the aorta itself. This proliferation of unstable, inflammation-prone microvessels inside the aortic wall plays this crucial destabilizing role in aneurysm progression. It basically accelerates the localized weakening.
Wow, okay. Next up, dyslipidemia, high cholesterol and fats. That came in at OR 1.33. Now, we all know high cholesterol is bad for plaque buildup, but how does it directly contribute to the dilation, the swelling of the aorta?
So the key here is something called endothelial dysfunction. Dyslipidemia is significantly related to AAA activity because high levels of lipids, fats, cause the delicate inner lining of the blood vessel, the endothelium, to malfunction. And this malfunction isn't just about laying down plaque. It changes how the vessel communicates chemically. It leads to increased stiffness, reduced elasticity, and crucially, it kicks off those inflammatory and atherosclerotic processes that cause the structural proteins like elastin and collagen to start degrading.
Got it. And finally, in this group, hypertension, high blood pressure, an OR of 1.31. We hear this link often, but how does that mechanical pressure specifically drive aneurysm risk?
Well, hypertension is primarily associated with increased arterial stiffness. That sustained, unnaturally high pressure is just constantly pounding, constantly stressing the aortic wall. Over time, the aorta loses its normal elasticity, and that constant mechanical tension promotes the weakening and the adverse remodeling that leads to that localized dilation, which is the very definition of AAA.
Okay, so just to recap that sort of assault, hypertension is physically pushing against a weakening wall, dyslipidemia is weakening the wall's basic function and promoting inflammation, and smoking is actively dissolving the wall's foundations, like a multi-pronged attack.
That's a perfect summary of that systemic vascular risk picture.
Right. We absolutely have to turn now to the most counterintuitive and, frankly, probably the most challenging finding of this entire study, the diabetes mellitus paradox.
Yes. This is where the sheer complexity of vascular disease really shows itself. The data clearly indicated that diabetes mellitus was associated with a reduced risk of AAA. It seemed to act as a potential protective factor, with an odds ratio of 0.84.
A reduced risk? That's wild. As we established, diabetes is usually a massive risk factor for almost every other form of macrovascular disease. It speeds up PAD, PVD, stroke risk. So if diabetes is so destructive everywhere else, what on earth is the leading theory for why it might be protective against the aorta specifically dilating?
So the main physiological theory revolves around stiffness, interestingly enough. Diabetic patients often experience quite a pronounced increase in aortic wall stiffness. This is due to something called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. And this stiffness, paradoxically, might actually counteract the mechanical forces that would normally lead to that localized ballooning and dilation that defines in AAA.
Okay, wait a minute. This is where my head starts spinning a bit. We just said hypertension is a risk, or 1.31, because it causes arterial stiffness. But now we're saying diabetes is protective, or 0.84, because it also causes arterial stiffness. Are these just two fundamentally different kinds of stiffness or different processes?
That is the million-dollar question for researchers, really. It's possible the stiffness induced by DM, perhaps due to those AGEs cross-linking proteins, is a different type of stiffness, maybe more restrictive, less prone to dilating compared to the stiffness caused by the constant mechanical strain of hypertension. It's also suggested that the overall process of aortic wall remodeling might actually decrease in DM patients, potentially slowing down the destructive process.
But there's another angle, too, the one that probably gets researchers most excited, relating to the drugs used to treat diabetes.
Absolutely, that's a huge area of interest. The protective effect might not be inherent to just having high blood sugar, but could be related to the medication treatments that DM patients typically use.
Like what?
Well, for example, many diabetic patients are on statins to manage dyslipidemia, which we know is a risk factor, and many are on specific anti-diabetic medications like metformin. These drugs, especially statins and possibly metformin, have known anti-inflammatory properties that could be independently masking or actually mitigating the AAA risk.
Wow. Okay, so if that medication hypothesis turns out to be true, that standard treatments for diabetes are unintentionally preventing AAAs, then we could potentially be looking at a whole new strategy for treating non-diabetic people who are at high risk for AAA. That's a massive clinical implication.
It completely shifts the research focus, doesn't it?
Mm.
From the disease itself to the therapy, it's a very, very exciting area for future research.
Definitely. Now let's briefly touch on the factors the researchers analyzed, but in the end, found no statistically significant association with AAA risk in this particular meta-analysis.
Okay. They looked at several things: advanced age, alcohol intake, having cancer, being overweight, and physical activity levels. And while the risk estimates, the ORs for some of these were, suggestive, none of them actually reached that critical threshold of statistical significance in the final pooled analysis.
But we need to put our critical thinking caps on here, especially when we look at advanced age and maybe physical activity. The p-values for these were incredibly close to the cutoff point, weren't they?
They were very close, yes. For instance, advanced age showed this massive OR of 4.17, suggesting it's a huge risk factor, intuitively. But the p-value just missed the significance mark at 0.055.
0.055, so just barely non-significant.
Exactly. And physical activity was similar, p 0.054. The study authors themselves explicitly caution that the lack of a significant association for these factors, especially the ones like age with strong ORs, can simply be due to the relatively small number of included studies that actually reported data on them.
So for our listener, seeing a p-value of 0.055 doesn't mean age is safe. It's more like a big yellow warning light from the research. It suggests if they had had just a bit more data, or if the underlying studies had been larger, age would almost certainly have shown up as highly significant.
Precisely. We have to treat those near misses as, well, provisional conclusions. The pooled results for those specific factors are just less stable because fewer studies contributed data compared to, say, smoking, which was covered in almost every single study included.
Okay, that's a really important methodological point. Let's move now to Section V, which adds this layer of geographic complexity to the whole risk profile. The researchers did a vital subgroup analysis comparing risk factors in Eastern versus Western countries, and they found significant differences for 6 key factors. This tells us risk really is context dependent.
Yeah, this regional breakdown is absolutely critical if we're thinking about global health strategy. The study confirmed that the odds ratios for sex, smoking, hypertension, diabetes, renal disease, and family history, they all behave differently across these 2 broad geographic groups.
Okay, let's break that down. Which factors showed a stronger association in Western countries?
So 3 factors really stood out with a distinctly stronger Western risk profile. First, the risk linked to smoking was significantly greater in Western populations compared to Eastern countries, and the statistical tests comparing the subgroups confirmed this difference was highly significant.
Why would the effect of smoking be different regionally? I mean, smoking is smoking, isn't it? Or maybe not.
Well, it likely points to differences in things like the duration of smoking, maybe the type of tobacco products used, or, crucially, the coexistence of other risk factors.
Ah, okay.
So if Western populations maybe have higher background rates of dyslipidemia, or perhaps less effective dietary or genetic protection against inflammation, then smoking acts as a much more potent trigger for AAA development in that specific context.
Got it. What was the second major difference leaning west?
Family history. That genetic susceptibility piece. It was only significantly considered a risk factor in Western countries where the OR was 2.43. In the Eastern countries studied, the OR was lower, 1.49, and it wasn't statistically significant.
So that suggests
Yeah.
that these specific genes linked to AAA are maybe less common in Eastern populations, or perhaps their effect is somehow dampened by lifestyle or diet in those regions.
That's the thinking, yes. Either the genes aren't as prevalent, or their impact is being modified by other factors common in those Eastern populations.
And the third Western-centric risk involved blood pressure, right?
Yes. Hypertension was significantly associated with AAA risk in Western countries, just like we found in the overall analysis. However, the study observed no significant association at all between hypertension and AAA risk in the Eastern countries group.
None at all. That's surprising.
It is. This might reflect different baseline rates of hypertension in the population studied, or perhaps different approaches to blood pressure management that could somehow skew the recorded risk in the available studies.
Okay, so we've got this clear cluster of risk factors: smoking, family history, and hypertension that seem to be particularly strong drivers in the West. Now, let's revisit that diabetes paradox in this regional light. Did that hold up globally?
It did not. That paradox also seemed to be primarily a Western phenomenon. The protective role of DM, that OR of around 0.81 in the West, was observed almost entirely in Western countries. In the Eastern countries group, DM showed basically no significant association. The OR was 1.04.
So essentially no effect either way in the East.
Pretty much. And again, if the protective effect is medication-based, this divergence might reflect differing pharmaceutical usage patterns or maybe different screening practices between the regions impacting who gets diagnosed and treated.
Okay, shifting focus to the East then, was there any factor that showed a markedly stronger association in Eastern populations?
Yes, one stood out quite starkly: renal disease. The risk association for renal disease was exceptionally strong in the Eastern countries subgroup, coming in at an OR of 3.55.
3.55. Well,
Yeah, compared to Western countries where it was significantly lower at 1.61. And the difference between these two groups was also statistically significant.
why would kidney disease be so much more potent as a driver of AAA risk specifically in the East, based on this data?
That's a tough question. It could possibly point to maybe a higher prevalence or severity of specific causes of chronic renal disease in the populations included in those Eastern studies. Perhaps certain types of infections or nephritis that induce a more aggressive systemic inflammatory response, which could then accelerate that neovascularization mechanism we talked about earlier.
This whole geographic disparity clearly needs some explanation. The researchers laid out 5 main hypotheses for why these risk factor profiles might diverge so dramatically. Let's maybe walk through them, not just as a list, but thinking about them as real possibilities.
Okay. The first hypothesis centers on genetic and ethnic variation. We know AAA has a familial component, so differences in the genetic backgrounds between the ethnicities surveyed in the Eastern versus Western studies could certainly influence the baseline disease prevalence and also how certain risk factors manifest.
That would definitely fit with why family history only popped up as a significant risk factor in the West, wouldn't it? If the Eastern populations they looked at don't commonly carry those specific susceptibility genes, then that risk factor just wouldn't show up in their data set.
Exactly. That makes logical sense. The second major hypothesis revolves around lifestyle factors. Differences in diet, for instance, maybe higher consumption of anti-inflammatory foods in some regions, different exercise habits, subtle differences in smoking rates, or maybe the intensity of smoking. These can all modulate the overall systemic risk profile.
Right. Third, they mentioned varying disease prevalence. The underlying proportions of other systemic conditions matter a lot. So if, say, a Western population has a significantly higher baseline rate of hyperlipidemia compared to an Eastern one, their overall vascular health is already poorer, right? So adding smoking on top of that might accelerate AAA development much faster in the West.
That's a key concept, yeah, the background health status. Fourth, and this is really crucial from a methodological standpoint, is screening and treatment levels. Different healthcare systems, different national screening guidelines, they can drastically affect the recorded incidence of AAA.
How so?
Well, for instance, if Western countries tend to screen high-risk males for AAA more aggressively, maybe using ultrasound, they're going to detect smaller asymptomatic aneurysms much earlier. These might be completely missed in less intensively screened Eastern populations until, perhaps, they rupture.
Ah, okay. So if the East is mainly catching the catastrophic ruptures, while the West is catching many small, slowly growing ones, the data sets aren't really measuring the same stage of the disease.
Precisely. They're capturing different points in the disease progression. which would absolutely skew the perceived incidence and potentially the risk factor associations. And the fifth hypothesis, which you always have to keep in mind with meta-analyses, is simply a study limitation.
Mm-hmm.
Only 6 of the 34 studies included in this big analysis were actually performed in Eastern countries. Just 6. That relatively small sample size means the pooled conclusions specifically for the Eastern subgroup are inherently less stable, less robust, compared to the results drawn from the 28 studies conducted in the West.
Okay, that's a really important caveat for interpreting those Eastern results. So despite the complexities and nuances, this systematic review gives us some pretty clear, actionable intelligence for public health strategy, doesn't it? Let's try to summarize the necessary interventions based on these confirmed risk factors.
Yeah, absolutely. Based on these findings, we really need to focus our efforts in 4 main areas. First, we need to implement highly targeted screening programs. The focus has got to be squarely on the highest risk populations.
Which are?
Primarily males over 65, current or former smokers, and anyone with a known family history of AAA. Screening that specific demographic efficiently will likely capture the vast majority of individuals truly at risk.
Okay. And once a small AAA is detected through screening, the second step is critical, establishing regular follow-up.
Absolutely. You need clear, detailed follow-up protocols for monitoring the progression of those small AAAs. The whole goal is to track the growth rate and intervene surgically before the diameter reaches a size where the risk of rupture becomes unacceptably high.
Makes sense. The third area then focuses entirely on managing those modifiable risk factors we spent so much time detailing earlier.
Right, and this means a non-negotiable emphasis on smoking cessation programs. Given that odds ratio near 3.4, that is the single most powerful preventative action we can take. Additionally, comprehensive management of hypertension and dyslipidemia, so controlling high blood pressure and high cholesterol effectively, is vital for reducing that overall systemic vascular stress that contributes to AAA.
And finally, number 4 is a broader health education effort.
Yes. We need health education campaigns, specifically designed to promote awareness of AAA, especially among those high-risk groups who might not even realize the connection between, say, their smoking history decades ago, their family history, and the specific, potentially deadly threat. Encouraging those lifestyle modifications is key to reducing the underlying systemic vascular risk.
Okay. Before we wrap up this massive deep dive, we really need to put our critical thinking hats back on for a moment. It's the expert speaker's job here to highlight the methodological caveats that the researchers themselves noted. This helps our listener understand the limitations of this kind of analysis. We absolutely cannot confuse association with causation.
That distinction is paramount, always. While the overall conclusions here are pretty robust because of the scale, we have to emphasize the high level of heterogeneity of study design. This analysis combined data from cross-sectional studies, retrospective studies, and prospective studies. Mixing those designs together inevitably introduces potential biases.
Okay, specifically, what kind of bias is most concerning when you rely heavily on retrospective data, looking backwards?
The big ones are selection bias and recall bias. Retrospective studies rely on participants accurately remembering things from the past, like exactly how much they smoked or how well their blood pressure was controlled 10 years ago.
Which is hard to do accurately.
Very hard. And if a person knows they now have AAA, they might subconsciously be more likely to recall or emphasize negative health habits from their past. This can lead to misclassification of risk factors and ultimately biased results.
Right. And the issue with the cross-sectional design, the snapshot studies, that limits our certainty about the why, doesn't it?
Precisely. Since most of the included studies were cross-sectional, they just captured a snapshot in time. This means we can say with confidence that factor X is associated with AAA in that snapshot, but we cannot definitively establish causality. We don't know for sure if the AAA led to, say, the renal disease observed at the same time, or if the renal disease came first and contributed to the AAA. The direction isn't clear.
Okay. And statistically, there was that problem you mentioned earlier. Substantial heterogeneity across many of these risk factors. Can you explain that again briefly?
Yeah, that's often indicated by a statistic called the I value, which was high, often greater than 50% for many factors here. This means the results from the individual studies, say, the OR for smoking, actually varied quite widely across the 34 different studies included.
So they weren't all finding the exact same level of risk.
Not at all. When we pool that data together in a meta-analysis, it's a bit like averaging wildly different numbers. That high heterogeneity is a statistical flag warning us that the results from the different included studies are kind of fighting each other, statistically speaking. And that variation couldn't be fully explained even by those geographic subgroup analyses we did.
That statistical reality means we have to treat the pooled odds ratios with respect, but also recognize they represent an average of sometimes quite conflicting underlying data.
Exactly. Treat them as the best overall estimate, but with that caveat. And lastly, we always have to acknowledge the potential for publication bias.
Yes.
Studies that find dramatic positive results, like that OR of 3.78 for male sex, are generally more likely to get published than studies that find only a weak association, or maybe no association at all. Our meta-analysis can only include data from published studies, which might slightly skew the overall picture if studies with null results were less likely to see the light of day.
Understood. Well, this has been an incredibly detailed look at a really critical, yet perhaps sometimes overlooked, vascular disease. The definitive risk factors seem clear: being male, smoking, having a family history, and that whole cluster of systemic, inflammatory, and cardiovascular diseases.
hmm And that essential understanding that where you live geographically seems to fundamentally change aspects of your risk profile, too.
Definitely. So here is the final provocative thought we want to leave you with, circling right back to that fascinating diabetes paradox. We established that diabetes mellitus is potentially protective, maybe because it causes a certain type of aortic wall stiffness, acting almost like a structural guardrail against dilation. Yet hypertension is clearly a risk factor, partly because it also causes arterial stiffness, but maybe acting more like a relentless stressor on the wall. What does this apparent contradiction tell us about the fundamental mechanics of how aortas degrade? Is the stiffness caused by those AGEs in diabetes somehow chemically different and therefore protective compared to the mechanical stiffness caused by sustained high pressure?
It's a fantastic question. And perhaps even more importantly, if that protective effect is indeed related, even partially, to the medication treatments common for diabetes, things like statins, maybe metformin, possibly others, could those specific therapeutic agents one day benefit high-risk non-diabetic patients to help prevent AAA?
It suggests the next frontier in AAA prevention might actually come straight out of the diabetes clinic pharmacy.
It really makes you think about those connections, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the critical risk factors for AAA. We really hope this knowledge helps you, and perhaps your health professionals, target prevention and screening more effectively.